Nathan Wells had been fighting fires for most of his life. 30 straight years on the line, staring down infernos that would have made most men turn and run. But he didn't run. Never had. He was the son of a firefighter. His father, Roy Wells, had died in the line of duty back in the summer of '81, crushed beneath the burning roof of a barn he'd gone into to save a boy and his dog. Nathan was just 15 at the time, and he remembered every detail of that day. The searing heat, the sirens, the neighbors weeping on the curb. His mother collapsed in the doorway when they brought the news. That moment carved itself into Nathan's soul, and somewhere deep inside, it lit a fire of its own. A fire that told him, "This is the path. This is your calling." He wasn't the loudest man in the firehouse. In fact, most folks would call him quiet, maybe even a little old school. He didn't care much for politics or small talk. But when the alarms sounded and the radios crackled to life, Nathan was always the first to suit up and the last to leave the scene. He believed in duty, in sacrifice, in showing up when it mattered most. He prayed in the truck sometimes, hands clasped around the steering wheel before barreling down some smoke-filled canyon road. His faith wasn't fancy. No big declarations, no waving hands in church. Just quiet trust. A Bible kept in his glove box, dog-eared and worn. But something had shifted in the last few years. The fires were different now, bigger, hotter, faster, less predictable. The seasoned men around him whispered it too. It ain't natural anymore. What used to be fire seasons had turned into year-round assaults. California wasn't just burning, it was unraveling. Entire communities wiped out in under an hour. Flames jumping 6-lane highways like they were nothing. Nathan had seen things lately that defied logic. Winds that changed direction in an instant. Flames that moved like they had purpose. The call came in just after dawn. It was February 9th, 2025. The sky had been bruised purple when Nathan pulled out of the driveway that morning, his thermos sloshing on the dash, and the radio already alive with static and chatter. Somewhere up near Brook Hollow Ridge, a fire had broken loose. It wasn't supposed to be fire season, not yet, not in February. But the winter had been dry as bone. The hills were brittle with dead underbrush. And the winds were wrong. Santa Ana winds sweeping in from the southeast when they had no business blowing that way. The dispatch had that tone Nathan hated. The one that meant this wasn't going to be routine. He met his crew at Station 17, already suited up, already sweating through his shirt. The wind outside was gusting sharp, pushing smoke sideways across the ridge. By 8 a.m., visibility was down to a quarter mile. The plume had grown tall and angry, stretching like a tornado of ash across the valley. They rolled out in a Type 3 engine, the cab rattling from the wind, ash swirling like snow in headlights. Nathan rode passenger side, scanning the ridgeline, jaw tight. Brook Hollow Ridge wasn't just another community on the map. It was personal. His sister's family had lived there for a few years back in the '90s. He remembered summer BBQs under the pines, lemonade in mason jars, laughter echoing through the trees. Now, as they crested the hill, he could barely recognize the place. A sea of red embers danced across the ground like fireflies from hell. Houses stood ghost-like through the smoke, empty shells waiting for judgment. They had one job: evacuate the last of the holdouts. The fire had jumped containment overnight and was closing in fast. Command said a handful of people were still unaccounted for. An elderly couple on Maple Drive, a family with small kids too afraid to leave, and possibly a retired veteran who refused to abandon his dog. Nathan's team split up. He and Mike, a rookie just 2 years in, took the east end of the cul-de-sac. They moved door to door, banging hard, calling out, kicking in if they had to. The first house was empty, porch light flickering like it was signaling SOS. The second had been abandoned in a rush, front door wide open, TV still playing static. The third, though, was different. Nathan spotted movement through the cracked blinds. He stepped inside, the heat already pressing in like a living thing. There, in the living room, sat an older man in a wheelchair. A little girl curled up in his lap, eyes wide with fear.
"She wouldn't leave me," the man said softly, voice shaking. "I told her to go, but she wouldn't." Nathan knelt beside them. "We don't have time to argue, sir. The fire's too close. We're getting you both out of here, now." With Mike's help, they transferred the man to a sling and carried him to the truck. Nathan took the girl in his arms. Her tiny fingers clutched his collar like she was holding onto life itself. The wind screamed as they made their way back down the gravel path. The smoke thickened in seconds, and the sky turned an eerie copper gray. Nathan's radio crackled to life.
"Unit 17, this is command. Be advised, wind shift due east. Fires jump the ridge. Repeat, jump the ridge." Nathan looked back. The ridge was glowing. Then it roared. It came like a freight train through a tunnel, a wall of flame 30 feet high barreling down toward them. He barely had time to shout before the heat hit. Mike threw himself over the man in the back seat. Nathan slammed the little girl into the cab and turned to shut the door. Then everything flashed white. There was no pain, no fire, no scream, just light. Bright, blinding light that swallowed him whole. For a moment, everything stopped. Time unraveled. The sound of his heartbeat faded into silence. The pressure in his chest vanished. The last thing he remembered before the world went quiet was the child's scream as the fire engulfed the truck. Then nothing. Or maybe everything. There was no sound, no fire, no weight. Just light, an endless glowing silence that wrapped around Nathan Wells like a warm quilt fresh out of the dryer. It wasn't harsh or blinding like the high beams of a truck. No. This light was softer than candle glow, and yet more powerful than anything he'd ever known. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. He floated in it. Or maybe he stood. He couldn't tell. There was no ground beneath his boots, no smoke in his lungs, no ache in his knees from the decades of hard miles. Everything that had once clung to him, grief, doubt, pain, was gone, burned away like fog in morning sun. And in its place was something he'd forgotten how to feel. Peace. Not just quiet, not just stillness, but peace that reached into every corner of what he now understood was his soul. He wasn't dead. Or maybe he was. The thought crossed his mind like a feather in the wind, but it didn't come with panic. In fact, it felt more like an answer than a question. If this was what people meant when they spoke of heaven, he thought, then all the hymns in church hadn't even scratched the surface. There were no pearly gates, no choir of angels strumming harps. But it was holy. More holy than anything he'd ever seen in a cathedral. The air itself hummed with meaning, with something ancient and alive. Nathan looked down, or what he imagined was down, and saw nothing of the body he'd known for nearly 6 decades. No bunker gear, no burned gloves, no boots, no scars on his knuckles, no wedding band. And yet, he was still himself. Somehow, more himself than he'd ever been. He felt whole. Not the kind of whole you feel when your blood pressure's stable and your cholesterol numbers are good, but the kind that comes from deep within, from being known, accepted, and fully loved. That's when he felt it. A presence, capital P. It wasn't a voice, not in the way humans speak, but he heard it clear as day inside the marrow of his soul. And he knew without a doubt, Jesus was here. Not the Jesus from the paintings in the church foyer, not the porcelain figure on the Christmas mantle. This was the real Jesus. His presence filled the space like wind fills a sail, vast and undeniable. It wasn't thunderous, but it was mighty. gentle but strong enough to bend the very laws of the universe. And he was coming closer. Nathan didn't see feet or movement in the way we understand it, but there was a sense of approach, like someone stepping through a veil. Suddenly, Nathan wasn't alone. The presence was with him now, surrounding him, filling him, drawing him in with a love so profound it nearly broke him. Not for what he had done, but for how undeserving he felt. "Nathan," the voice said, not aloud but within, like it had been etched into his very being. He dropped to his knees. Or, he thought he did. In this place, posture wasn't a matter of joints and gravity. It was something his soul did on its own, responding to majesty the way flowers turn to the sun. He wanted to speak, to cry, to apologize for every time he'd doubted, every time he'd wondered if God was still watching while the world burned. But the presence already knew. There was no hiding here. There was also no condemnation. He waited for judgment, but it never came. Instead, there was warmth, and a knowing gaze he couldn't see but somehow felt. Jesus saw every scar Nathan carried, every call he couldn't forget, every body he couldn't save, every time he walked into fire not knowing if he'd walk back out. And he loved him still. Nathan whispered the only thing that made sense. "Why?" And the answer was as simple as it was unfathomable. "Because I love you." Tears welled up inside him, though he had no eyes to cry with, and spilled into the silence like rain hitting dry soil. He had lived a life of service. He had given his strength, his time, his health, and nearly his life more than once. But never had he felt more alive than in this moment, bathed in the truth that he was not forgotten, not overlooked, not abandoned, and certainly not unloved. He didn't know how long he stood there. Time wasn't a thing in that place. It could have been seconds or centuries. But slowly, he began to remember. The fire, the girl, the old man in the back seat, Mike's face shouting through the smoke. The moment the world went white, it all came rushing back like the tide. He looked again, this time with new eyes, and saw the fire from above. He could see the truck, half buried in ash, the windshield cracked and glowing. He could see his own body slumped forward in the cab. But there was no panic. It was like looking at a shell that no longer fit. He felt no pull to return, no fear of letting go. But then, the view shifted. The fire wasn't just a natural disaster. From this vantage point, he could see that it was alive in ways no scientist could ever explain. Within the flames danced shadows, dark figures slithering like smoke, twisting with purpose and hunger. They moved, with intelligence, with intent. They weren't human, but they weren't mindless either. They were drawn to fear, to despair, to bitterness. They fed off it. Nathan's soul trembled, not with fear but with the realization that he had spent his life fighting the symptom, not the disease. The fires he'd fought with hoses and grit were only the physical side of something far more sinister. Jesus stood beside him now, though again, not in a way of bodies and space, and said gently, "You needed to see the truth. Not all fire is made of heat and flame. Some is born of brokenness. This is not just a forest fire, Nathan. This is a spiritual one." Nathan turned, his heart pounding in a body he no longer had. "What do I do?" Jesus looked at him with eyes that saw through time, through doubt, through every wall Nathan had ever built. "You go back," he said, "and you tell them." Nathan didn't speak right away, not because he didn't want to, but because there were no words in the language of men that could fully grasp what he was witnessing. His thoughts didn't tumble out like they used to. They floated now, carried by something deeper than reason. He was standing, not on solid ground, but in a space so real it made the physical world feel like a dream. Around him stretched the fire he had just died in, but it looked nothing like it had before. What he had once known as smoke and flame now writhed like a living organism. The blaze pulsed and breathed like it had a heartbeat. Every flame moved with purpose. Every spark carried intent. And Nathan knew, without anyone telling him, that what he was seeing was not natural. He could see the entire landscape from a place outside of time and space, a kind of elevated awareness. Below, the flames consumed homes, hills, and trees with violent hunger. But they didn't move like random chaos. They moved like soldiers, coordinated, strategic, attacking places that were emotionally and spiritually vulnerable. There was no randomness here. This was precision. Jesus stood beside him. Again, not as a man of flesh and blood, but as a presence so vast and radiant, it made Nathan feel both incredibly small and infinitely loved at the same time. His light didn't cast shadows. It dispelled them. Where Jesus stood, the darkness shrank back like mist before the morning sun. But just beyond his light, the shadows danced in the fire, grotesque, slithering, and ancient. They're not just flames, are they? Nathan asked quietly. Jesus didn't answer immediately. He let the question linger in the holy silence between them. Then he turned to Nathan, his voice rich and sorrowful all at once. Number. What you are seeing is the physical manifestation of a deeper war, one that has been raging long before your time and will continue until the hearts of my people return to me. Nathan watched in stunned silence as the flames twisted into shapes, shadows with hollow eyes and contorted limbs. These weren't just tricks of the fire. They were entities, feeding on destruction like vultures over carrion. He saw them swirl through smoke, diving into homes not yet touched by flame, wrapping themselves around beams and windows like serpents coiling to strike. The darkness wasn't random. It was calculated, and it was growing stronger with every act of despair, hatred, and spiritual apathy it could find. He turned back to Jesus, his voice barely a whisper. What are they? Jesus looked into the depths of the blaze, and his voice carried the weight of eternity. They are the fruits of corruption, born from the choices my people have made over generations. Every time love was traded for greed, truth for convenience, sacrifice for self. This is what took root. These fires are not just environmental. They are spiritual. And they are the consequence of a nation, a world, that has turned away from me. Nathan felt something inside him crumble. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was grief. Deep, soul-wrenching grief. Not just for the world, but for all the times he'd walked past a suffering neighbor too busy to ask how they were. For all the prayers he hadn't prayed. For the years he'd believed he was saving lives with water, while missing the deeper fire devouring souls. But why now? He asked. Why are they stronger than ever? Jesus' expression grew even more solemn. Because the distance has grown. My name is still spoken, but my presence is no longer welcomed in many hearts. People attend churches but don't seek me. They worship comfort more than truth. They celebrate self more than sacrifice. They have created a world where I am a footnote rather than the foundation. And the enemy has taken full advantage of that. Nathan looked out over the burning valley and saw people's homes, their memories, their lives turned to ash. But now, layered over that physical destruction, he saw something else. He saw families that hadn't spoken in years, bitter feuds festering in silence. He saw marriages falling apart behind perfectly manicured lawns. He saw churches filled with smiling faces but empty hearts. And with each of those moments, every ignored need, every unresolved anger, the darkness had found an entry point. And yet, amid the ruin, he noticed something strange. Little flickers, like candles that refused to be snuffed out. In one cul-de-sac, he saw a man kneeling in prayer as fire bore down. In another home, a woman clutched a worn Bible, her lips trembling with Psalm 91. In a scorched field, a group of children sang worship songs, their hands joined tightly. The shadows hissed near them, but couldn't cross some invisible line. Jesus pointed. "Those are my people," he said. "Their faith is imperfect, but it is true. Their hearts remain open. Where there is true faith, the darkness loses its grip. The fire can touch the earth, but it cannot consume the light." Nathan watched, wide-eyed, as the flames in those areas slowed, then sputtered. They burned the land, yes, but they could not devour the souls. The destruction was real, but it was not complete. Light held its ground, and where it did, others nearby were shielded too. "They are like anchors," Nathan said in awe. "They're holding back the tide." Jesus smiled gently. "Even the smallest light can push back great darkness." A tear formed, not from sorrow this time, but from something deeper. Hope. Fragile, flickering hope. Nathan turned back to the blaze, this time with clearer eyes. "So what now? What do you want me to do?" Jesus stepped closer, and his words fell like seeds into the soil of Nathan's soul. "You must return. Tell them what you've seen. Warn them. Not out of fear, but out of love. Let them know this isn't about climate or politics. It's about the heart. And if the heart doesn't change, the fire won't stop." Nathan's spirit trembled. "But who will believe me?" "Some will mock, some will walk away, but others will listen. And for them your words will be the beginning of a great return." Nathan nodded slowly. He didn't know how to speak of things this big, this deep, this eternal. But he remembered the girl in his arms, the old man in the truck, Mike calling his name through the smoke. He thought of his wife Carol, always waiting up for him, always believing there was something sacred about the way he ran toward danger when others ran away. "I'll go," he said, voice steady now. "Even if it costs me everything. I'll tell them." Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder. Not a hand of flesh, but of light and authority, love and power. It pulsed through Nathan's soul like thunder wrapped in peace. "I am with you always," he said, "even in the fire." And with that, the scene began to shift again. The sky darkened. The light receded. Nathan felt the gravity of a world calling him back. The fire, the visions, the presence. It all began to fade. But the message burned brighter than ever. He was going home. The first thing Nathan Wells felt was weight. Not emotional or spiritual, but literal weight. His own body pressing down on the hospital mattress like a sack of wet concrete. After what had felt like an eternity floating through light and glory, the return to gravity was jarring. His chest rose and fell in staggered, stuttering rhythms. Breathing, once effortless, now felt like work, like each inhale had to be coaxed out of collapsed lungs by sheer will. The fluorescent lighting above flickered slightly, casting pale reflections in the window that blurred the line between day and night. Somewhere nearby, a monitor beeped in time with his heart, each tone a stubborn declaration that he was, by some miracle, still alive. He blinked. Once, twice. Then came the voices. "Mr. Wells?" The sound was muffled, distant at first, then closer, sharper, familiar. "Daddy?" A girl's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. His gaze drifted toward the figures gathered beside the bed, blurry at first, then coming into focus like a photograph in a dark room. Carol was there, eyes red-rimmed and brimming with tears, her hand gripping his like she was afraid to let go. His daughter Emily stood just behind her, one hand covering her mouth in disbelief. And his son Jacob, strong, quiet Jacob, stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed but shoulders trembling. Nathan tried to speak, but his throat was raw. as if he'd swallowed smoke and sand. The only thing he could manage was a dry rasp that sounded more like a whisper than a word. Carol leaned forward, pressing a cup of ice water to his lips. It felt like heaven, cold, real, grounding. "You scared the life out of us," she said, her voice cracking. "They said you were gone. Your heart stopped. You weren't breathing. But then, you came back." He wanted to tell her everything. About the fire, about Jesus, about the shadows and the light, about the message. But the words sat heavy in his chest, tangled in awe and disbelief. He closed his eyes, not in exhaustion but in prayer. "Lord, help me say this right." Later that evening, when the nurses dimmed the lights and the steady rhythm of the machines had faded into background noise, Carol pulled her chair closer and reached for his hand again. "You've got that look," she whispered. He opened his eyes. "What look?" "The same one you had the day your dad died. The day you swore you'd follow in his footsteps. The day you changed." Nathan took a slow breath. "I saw him, Carol." She didn't ask who. She didn't roll her eyes or try to rationalize what she knew he meant. She just waited. That's what she'd always done. Waited for the truth to find its way to the surface. "I died," he said. "For a few minutes. Maybe more. And I saw Jesus. He showed me things. Terrible things. Beautiful things. Truths I didn't even know I'd been running from." Carol said nothing. Her eyes never left his. "There's something behind the fires, Carol. Something more than fuel and wind. Something alive. Something evil." He paused, his voice cracking. "And something holy pushing back against it." Tears spilled silently down her cheeks. "I believe you," she whispered. Those 3 words cracked something open in him. The dam broke, and for the next hour, Nathan poured out everything. The light. The silence. The presence. The sentient fire filled with shadows. The pockets of light where prayer had pushed back the darkness. The gentle, overwhelming authority in Jesus' voice when he'd said, "You must tell them." He expected Carol to ask if he was sure it wasn't just a dream, a hallucination from a lack of oxygen or the trauma of smoke inhalation. But she didn't. She held his hand tighter, nodded slowly, and said the most grounding words he could have hoped for. "Then that's what you'll do." The days that followed were a blur of physical recovery and emotional upheaval. The local paper ran a short story on his survival, a headline that read, "Veteran firefighter survives fiery collapse in Shasta County blaze." But no article could capture what had really happened. Even the doctors were baffled. His vitals had flatlined for nearly 7 minutes. By every metric, he shouldn't have come back at all. And yet here he was, tired, sore, but undeniably alive. Word spread fast in the community. People dropped by the hospital with flowers, homemade pies, handshakes, and wide-eyed questions. Most of them just wanted to say thank you. "Glad you're okay. God must have been watching over you." Nathan accepted each visitor with quiet gratitude. But the fire inside him, the other fire, grew hotter with each passing day. One night, the local pastor, Reverend Dalton, came to visit. He'd known Nathan for over 20 years but had never seen him like this. Intense, soft-spoken, but glowing with something deeper than survival. "I hear you've seen something," the pastor said gently. Nathan nodded. "It wasn't just fire down there. There's a war going on, Reverend. And it's not being fought with hoses or bulldozers. It's being fought in the hearts of men." Reverend Dalton said nothing for a long while. Then he simply placed his hand on Nathan's shoulder. "Maybe God brought you back to say what the rest of us were too scared to." That was the beginning. When Nathan was released from the hospital, he stepped outside and looked up at the pale February sky, sunlight bleeding through a haze that hadn't cleared since the fire. The air smelled faintly of ash, but he didn't flinch. He inhaled deeply, closed his eyes, and said, "I'm ready." At first, he shared his story only with family and a few close friends, people who'd known him long enough to trust that he wasn't the kind to make up tales. Their reactions varied. Some wept openly. Others grew silent, introspective. A few nodded solemnly, confessing that they too had felt something was wrong in the world, that the fires felt different. Then the invitations started. A local church asked him to speak on a Wednesday night. The following Sunday, another invited him to share his testimony before the morning service. Then came a call from the volunteer fire department in a neighboring town. Then a school. Then a community center. He didn't bring slides or handouts. No stage theatrics or scripted speeches. Just his voice, his story, and the truth that had been burned into his soul. And everywhere he went, people leaned in. Some cried, some nodded. A few walked out. But many stayed behind, asking quiet questions they were too afraid to ask before. Was God still listening? Had we pushed him too far? Could we still come back? Nathan never claimed to be a prophet. He didn't wear a collar or quote scripture with fancy footnotes. But he did speak with a kind of authority that only comes from experience. The kind that comes from dying, seeing the truth, and being sent back with a mission. He wasn't fighting fires anymore. He was fighting for hearts. Nathan Wells never imagined that his greatest mission would begin after his death. But now, months after that February morning when he walked into the flames and never expected to walk out again, he was living a second life. One defined not by hoses and turnouts, but by pulpits and folding chairs, community centers and country churches, living rooms and lunch counters. Wherever people would listen, he would go. And wherever he went, he carried the fire. Not the one that destroys, but the one that awakens. Word of his experience had spread faster than any wildfire he'd ever faced. What started as a whisper in a hospital room became a testimony carried on by hearts hungry for truth. He spoke in small-town sanctuaries, sometimes to just a dozen faithful souls, other times to packed gymnasiums with folding chairs squeezed shoulder to shoulder. He wasn't a polished speaker. He still spoke like the fireman he'd always been, plain-spoken, direct, and honest. But there was a weight in his voice that no one could deny. When he said, "I saw Jesus," people leaned in. When he said, "The fire isn't just on the ground, it's in our hearts," they listened. And slowly, something began to shift. He saw it first in his own church. Sunday attendance, which had thinned in recent years, began to swell, not with those looking for entertainment, but with those searching for purpose. Prayer meetings that used to gather 6 or 7 faithful old-timers were now filled with 30, 40, sometimes 50 people, kneeling at pews and weeping for their families, their town, their country. Men who hadn't stepped foot in a church in years were showing up in baseball caps and worn boots, clutching Bibles like lifelines. And no one judged them, because something deeper was happening. Something no fire could touch. In Reading, a local fire chief requested Nathan to speak to the department. He stood in the break room where he'd shared 100 midnight meals and told his brothers in uniform what he had seen. Tough men. Men who'd carried burned bodies from wreckage and pulled strangers from collapsed rooftops. Sat silent, some wiping tears away before anyone could notice. One of the rookies asked, "Chief, if what you saw is true, what are we supposed to do now?" Nathan answered without hesitation. "Start by lighting your own corner of the world. Pray with your kids. Ask forgiveness. Speak the truth. Live like someone's soul depends on it. Because it does." Not everyone welcomed the message. In one suburban megachurch, after sharing his story, a senior pastor approached him backstage and said with a tight smile, "Powerful story, brother. but let's keep it metaphorical for the audience's sake. Nathan politely declined future invitations from that church. Others scoffed outright. A regional paper published an op-ed mocking his story, calling it a hallucination born of carbon monoxide and trauma. On social media, skeptics labeled him a religious zealot, a man using a brush with death to drum up attention. Nathan didn't argue. He'd been called worse. And besides, Jesus had already warned him, some will mock, some will turn away, but others will hear. And those were the ones he cared about. He began receiving letters, dozens at first, then hundreds, handwritten notes from elderly couples in Kentucky, emails from single moms in Detroit, voicemails from truck drivers in Texas. They all said the same thing in different words. Something in your story felt real. I've been asleep, but I don't want to be anymore. Nathan called these people the flickers. Tiny lights in the darkness, each one flickering with new resolve. And flickers, he'd learned, could spread. A pastor in Oregon told him that after hearing Nathan's testimony, his church canceled all programs for a month and held nothing but prayer meetings. A woman in Tennessee shared that her teenage son, after watching a video of Nathan's testimony online, put down his phone and asked to be baptized. The spiritual landscape around him was shifting. He could feel it, not just in churches, but in everyday moments. There was an urgency in the air, like the wind right before a storm. People were waking up. Not everyone, not everywhere, but enough. And sometimes, enough is all it takes to start a fire of a different kind. One morning in April, Nathan stood in the center of a small farming town just outside of Chico. The local church had burned down the previous year, and services were held under a white tent pitched beside the scorched foundation. As he spoke that morning, the breeze picked up, and he paused to let the wind pass through the flaps. Then he looked around at the 60 or so people gathered, faces lined with life, hands calloused from real work, hearts cracked open by pain and prayer. And he saw it again. The light, not visible like firelight, but real. In that moment, Nathan understood something that made his knees go weak. The fire hadn't gone away. The darkness was still there, still growing, still hunting. But so was the light. It was spreading, not through sermons or slogans, but through real lives being changed, through repentance, through surrender, through a return to the simple, powerful truth that Jesus was still calling. As the service ended, an older man in his 70s came forward with his wife. They looked weathered, worn, like they'd seen their fair share of battles. The man grasped Nathan's hand, his voice rough with emotion. "You said the fire is feeding off what's inside us," he said. "Well, you were right. I've been carrying hate in my heart for years. I thought it was justified, but it's just been eating me alive." Nathan didn't say much. He didn't have to. He simply nodded and said, "You're not alone. But now that you've seen it, you've got a choice." The man nodded. "I've already made it." Nathan watched as the couple knelt together by the remains of the church, hands clasped in prayer, heads bowed low. That night, as he lay in a borrowed bed in the back room of a farmhouse, Nathan stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Lord, thank you for letting me see this. Not just the darkness, but the light that's fighting back." His journey wasn't over. He knew that now. The fire was still burning, both in the forests and in the hearts of men. But so was the light. And every story he told, every life that turned toward truth, was one more flame that didn't belong to destruction, but to redemption. And Nathan Wells, the firefighter who once thought his job was to save homes, now understood his calling had always been to save something far more sacred: souls. As spring turned to summer and wildflowers began reclaiming the charred edges of old fire lines, Nathan Wells found himself reflecting more than ever. The days had grown longer, the sun warmer, but a weight still lingered deep in his chest. Not the kind of burden that broke a man, but the kind that reminded him every moment mattered. It had been nearly 5 months since he'd walked through fire, died, and met the one who lit up the universe without casting a single shadow. 5 months since he returned to tell the world what most weren't ready to hear, that the fires we see are merely the smoke of something far deeper. And the time to choose is running out. He still saw it all, as clear as the morning he opened his eyes in the hospital bed. Jesus standing beside him in a realm beyond time, showing him what lay beneath the surface of California's infernos. He remembered the fire alive with unseen evil, the shadow creatures feeding on hate, fear, and spiritual decay. But more than that, he remembered the moment Jesus revealed 2 futures, 2 paths diverging in the smoke. The first had been terrifying. In it, the world continued as it was, numb, distracted, angry. Cities buzzed with noise but lacked soul. Churches remained open but empty of real faith, places where people gathered to be seen, not saved. In that future, the fires didn't stop. They grew, hotter, faster, more cunning. Nathan saw firestorms descend on communities that had once known peace. He saw people turn on one another in panic, blame each other while ignoring the rot within. And he saw the shadows dance with glee, multiplying with every soul that chose comfort over conviction, silence over truth. In that path, hope flickered out one quiet compromise at a time. But then Jesus showed him the other future. It began with flickers, small acts of faith, unnoticed by the world. A grandmother praying for her grandkids each night at 9 p.m. sharp. A trucker turning off his radio and singing hymns into the dark while hauling freight across the Midwest. A father who, after hearing Nathan speak, gathered his family around the dinner table, opened the Bible and said, "Let's talk about something real." And those flickers grew. They connected. In towns and cities across the country, lights began to push back the darkness, not through politics or programs, but through humility, repentance, and love. Nathan saw entire neighborhoods transformed, not because their buildings were spared, but because their hearts were changed. In that future, even when wildfires came, they didn't consume the same way. Their power was checked by invisible walls, walls built by prayer, forged in faith. And the shadows? They screamed, because they couldn't feed where love lived. They couldn't grow where truth stood tall. Now, sitting on the porch of his modest home in Redding, sipping coffee from the same mug he'd used for 20 years, Nathan felt the weight of that vision like a second spine. It held him up, reminded him why he couldn't stop speaking, why rest had to wait. A breeze stirred the wind chimes beside him, and he thought again of Jesus' last words to him before sending him back. "Tell them, Nathan, the fires are a warning, but they are also an invitation, and the time for indecision is over." He hadn't known what those words fully meant at first, but now he did. Indecision wasn't neutrality. It was surrender by default. It was letting the fire decide your fate because you wouldn't. The world was teetering on a razor's edge, not just environmentally, not politically, but spiritually. And folks had to choose, light or dark, truth or deception, surrender or pride. There wasn't room for both, not anymore. Nathan had seen too much to play it safe. And so, he kept going, week after week, town after town, telling his story with the same steady voice he once used on fire lines when lives were on the line. Because they still were. Only now, it wasn't flames that threatened them. It was the slow, creeping lie that God was no longer calling, that nothing mattered, that we could just drift and scroll and shop and shout until the sky burned red. But Nathan knew better. He'd stood in the light. He'd heard the voice that said, "Even the smallest light can push back the greatest darkness." And so, he poured himself out. Every testimony, every handshake, every teary-eyed conversation after a service was another log on the altar of his second life. Some nights he ached from the burden. Carol would find him staring at the ceiling, jaw tight, hands clasped as if bracing for something he couldn't quite name. "You okay?" she'd ask softly, and he'd nod. Just thinking about the choice. She knew which one he meant. It wasn't just his choice anymore. It was ours. And as long as he had breath in his lungs and fire in his soul, he'd keep reminding people that there's still time, that mercy hadn't closed its doors, that grace was still knocking, on country roads, in city apartments, in fire stations, in quiet kitchens at 2 a.m. But the door wouldn't stay open forever. Nathan Wells had walked through fire and come back with more than scars. He came back with a message. And now, it was up to us to decide what we'd do with it. Because in the end, the fire would come either way. The only question was, would it consume us or refine us? Nathan Wells never asked to become a messenger. He was just a man who ran into fires because someone had to. But when the fire took him further than he'd ever gone, beyond smoke and flame, beyond breath and heartbeat, he returned with something greater than survival. He came back with sight. In the months that followed, he never called himself a prophet or preacher. He didn't claim to have all the answers. What he had was a story that burned brighter than doubt, a story that stirred something deep in the hearts of those willing to listen. And now, that story belongs to us, to the grandmother praying in secret, to the pastor clinging to truth in a culture of compromise, to the weary believer wondering if faith still matters, to the firefighter who feels like the battle's already lost. Nathan's journey reminds us that while the fires of this world may rage, they don't have the final word. There is a light that cannot be swallowed, a voice still calling, a choice still offered. The time to choose is now, because even the smallest flame, when lit by love and truth, can set a soul ablaze. And when enough souls burn with that light, even hell's fire doesn't stand a chance.